So welcome. This is a webinar from Lifelong Learning. It's co-authored by the eFormation Learning Community and Building Faith, which are both ministries of lifelong learning at Virginia Theological Seminary. And I believe next we have our prayer. So I will turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you. So I'm glad to offer a prayer as we open and gather today that is a beautiful justice prayer that was written and offered by Valerie Kaur, who is an author and member of the Sikh faith. And this prayer was penned and shared first on November 9th, 2016. And so let's join in prayer together now. God, in our tears and agony, we hold our children close and confront the truth. The future is dark, but my faith dares me to ask, what if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a country still waiting to be born? What if the story of America is one long labor? What if all the mothers who came before us, who survived genocide and occupation, slavery and Jim Crow, racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia, political oppression and sexual assault are standing behind us now, whispering in our ear, "You are brave." What if this is our great contraction before we birth a new future? Remember the wisdom of the midwife. Breathe, she says, then push. Now it is time to breathe, but soon it will be time to push. Soon it will be time to fight for those we love. Muslim father, Sikh son, trans daughter, indigenous brother, immigrant sister, white worker, the poor and forgotten, and the ones who cast their vote out of resentment and fear. Let us make an oath to fight for the soul of America and the world, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be, with revolutionary love and relentless optimism. In the name of the divine within us and around us, we find everlasting optimism. Within your will, may there be grace for all of humanity. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Jennifer. That was wonderful. There we go. So I'm Catherine Malloy. I am the Director of Christian Formation Resources in Lifelong Learning at Virginia Theological Seminary, which means that I look at curriculum and I do webinars and things like this to help equip people for ministry. So that's who I am and why I'm here. But I want you to meet these wonderful panelists that we have. But first, I want to just let you know our order today is going to be a little different from how we normally do. We normally do like one panelist talks for a longer period, questions, the other panelist for a longer period, then questions. And it will follow that pattern generally, but we'll still have some, we'll have more time for like application and discussion a little bit later on to kind of brainstorm ideas and things like that. So, so you might notice that we're getting through their presentations quickly, but we're not finishing quickly. So, and now I will let you all just introduce yourselves, Jennifer and Francisco, please.
Okay, I'm Jennifer. I live in the Seattle, Washington area. I have served in churches and seminary settings for about 25 years and recently just launched a new ministry offering called the Justice and Faith Collective. So I'll leave it at that for a quick introduction and then dive in a few minutes.
Hello, friends. I'm Francisco Garcia, and I am a priest in the Episcopal Church. I'm currently a PhD student in Theological Studies, Ethics, and Action at Vanderbilt University. And but I am originally from Los Angeles, and my background is as a community and labor organizer, and then in applying these teachings and methods in the context of church, and as a in peace and justice ministries, and as a rector in sort of different faith contexts, and also in interfaith justice organizing efforts. And so my dissertation has to do with exploring how our ecclesiologies can be informed by social movement traditions, by community organizing practices, and to think about a theology of organizing, rooted in organizing and praxis for the church, for transforming the church, and what it means to be church. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. And I think that Jennifer, you're up.
All right, thank you. So just to fill you in a little bit more on background, I have spent a lot of my years in the Presbyterian Church USA. I'm a graduate of Fuller Theological Seminary, also a recent graduate of Prescott College. I went back to school and did a master's in social justice and community organizing. But I served in Presbyterian churches for many years, not ordained, although I did complete the MDiv. I served doing family ministries, doing youth and children's ministries over the years. And then about 7 years ago, I switched to the United Methodist and took a call there, and have spent 6 years serving in the United Methodist Church before I decided to go back to school and start a business. So I wanted to begin, deep breath, with a sharing about my anti-racism journey. And this is just a brief introduction to how that was fleshed out in ministry and in a church context. As I was on my own journey of realizations and learning and seeing the ways that that white people are overvalued, and that people of color and people of different ethnicities and people with different sexual orientations are undervalued, I began to think about how to engage this conversation more deeply in the church. And so I did a doll test. If you're familiar with the 1940s doll test that was done by Dr. Clark, and was used in the Brown versus Board of Education trial that ended school segregation. It's a test where there are a variety of dolls of different skin colors presented with some questions. Which doll is nice? Which doll do you want to be friends with? Questions like that. So I spent 2 summers doing a little series in Sunday school where I conducted the doll test, and I did some explorations with kids in our Sunday school. And I was really surprised. We are not in the 1940s anymore, and I was serving a progressive United Methodist congregation. And I was surprised to see the responses and how much race influenced the kids' engagement around the dolls. So I started to think more, and I realized that Vacation Bible School is this opportunity where we have the kids together for 15 hours. At our church, we had about 150 kids at Vacation Bible School and 80 volunteers. We would have about 30 teenage volunteers and 50 adults. So for this huge chunk of time, it's really a bigger chunk of quality time than we get at other times throughout the year to be together. So I realized that was an opportunity for us to begin learning and discussing together. So the first year I we bought a regular curriculum. We bought a group curriculum, Passport to Peru, and I brought in a few guest speakers, and we started to engage in an anti-racism conversation. And after that, I realized we needed to go a lot deeper. And so we put together a team of volunteers who were willing to learn and hired an equity coach. And together we learned and studied over a year, and we wrote a VBS curriculum we called The Power of Inclusion, based on the story of Noah. And that was incredibly it was incredibly powerful. It was a really, really phenomenal experience. You can see here in the picture, Courtney, who is the equity consultant that worked with us teaching. And, we taught all of this through recreation and crafts and social science and drama and music and small group discussion. That was a really great experience. So we decided to do it again. When I first started, I'm not sure that I thought maybe this is a one-year thing, but I didn't think that it was a forever thing. But I realized eventually that this is the work of a lifetime. So the next year we bought a curriculum, Who is My Neighbor from Shine, and then we adapted that into an anti-racism curriculum. And then in 2020, we wrote another curriculum from scratch called CommUNITY Allies, and we ended up doing that online. So we can go ahead to the next slide. That's a little bit of how we began our anti-racism work, which ended up being one of those great ways to spread the work in the church. The church really began to develop an openness to going a lot deeper and is now doing a lot of decolonizing work as a church. We also were exploring this idea of no human being illegal. When family separations started in the United States, when children started being separated from their parents at the border, there were members of our church that really wanted to get involved and do something. So Julia, a church member, had grown up on the California border and was fluent in Spanish, had taught in a school at the border for many years. And so we started exploring how we could get involved, and Julia started going to meetings. Our church was already on a journey towards exploring becoming a sanctuary church, but we were having some hesitations from some congregants around that. So we ended up getting an opportunity, and Julia housed about 25 people that came out of the Northwest Detention Center, all asylum seekers who were in transition to go and live then with people that had sponsored them to be in the United States. So after that, we realized that there were a lot of people that were stuck in the detention center because they didn't have a person to sponsor them. So our family ended up getting to sponsor Danny, a woman that is an asylum seeker from Honduras. And Danny came to live with our family for a year, which became a wonderful friendship and opportunity to learn and understand the journey of immigration much more deeply. And it became a powerful opportunity for Danny to become a part of the congregation and occasionally do children's sermons with me, which was really fun, and just have students get to know her. My role often in the beginning, when we were housing 25 people, was fundraising within the church, whether it was a Dollar Tree after worship or grant writing, and then showing up at the Goodwill with my church credit card because asylum seekers would get out of detention with usually only the prison clothes that had been given to them. Oftentimes the clothes that they wore coming into detention were disposed of, so they often didn't even have anything left that had belonged to them. So we would go to a nice Goodwill store and find a small new wardrobe. We had several visits to the Northwest Detention Center. This picture here is an RV. It's an old RV that's parked right outside the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, Washington, where when people are released from detention, they simply open the gate and let people out. And people are flown there. People in detention don't know where they are or what to do. And this phenomenal RV greets them with an open door and a place to come in and rest and get a change of clothes and use a phone and be able to call people and find some help. So this was all an opportunity for us to get a much deeper understanding and build relationships. Next slide. Through all of that, and for many years, I had been in the process of decolonizing this idea of mission. I had served as a international volunteer with the Presbyterian Church USA in Albania many years prior, and so had long been in this process of reconsidering and thinking through what is mission. And a few of these quotes that I want to share from Paulo Freire and Che Guevara. Love is an act of courage, not of fear. Love is commitment to others. No matter where the oppressed are found, the act of love is commitment to their cause, the cause of liberation. I am more and more convinced that true revolutionaries must perceive the revolution because of its creative and liberating nature as an act of love. The revolution is made by people to achieve their humanization. What indeed is the deeper motive which moves individuals to become revolutionaries, but the dehumanization of people? And finally, revolutionary leaders do not go to the people in order to bring them a message of salvation, but in order to come to know through dialogue with them, both their objective situation and their awareness of that situation. Next screen. So as we began to decolonize mission, we found an organization called Border Links that's based in Tucson, Arizona, and did an intergenerational and multi-partisan mission experience, learning experience with them, which was a fabulous experience where we did an immigration history timeline, relearning US history through the lens of immigration. We walked migrant desert trails, the trails where people cross that are looking to cross away from a wall. And as we were circled over by vultures, we're reminded of how dangerous the desert is. And as we passed many checkpoints, we're exposed to the militarization of the US border. Seeing the US border wall up close was powerful. Here we are in Nogales, Mexico, standing right there at the border that goes right through the middle of a city. There's houses on both sides directly across the wall. It was really fascinating. We did an immigration scavenger hunt that helped us to get a deeper understanding of what does it mean when we say, why don't people just immigrate the legal way? That's a complicated statement, and what is legal is quite complex. So that was really helpful. And we led a worship service featuring roundtable discussion about our experiences with our whole church, which was also a really powerful new way of engaging in service and learning. Next slide. So a couple other things. Here are kids from our children's choir singing. I worked with a lot of folks in the community to begin the first Martin Luther King Jr. event on MLK Day in town. So our children's choir got to sing Lift Every Voice with performers. And one of the things that made all of this possible is that our church has an endowment that came from a property sale, and that was dedicated to children and families in poverty. And that endowment really helped to fund this work. Just sharing here, justiceandfaith.com is the website where my organization now offers curriculum, consulting, and coaching. The woman that we hired, the equity coach, and I continue to work together, and we write curriculum. We have a new one just coming out called Let My People Go: The Power of Moses, Miriam, and Midwives, and it's an anti-racism curriculum for faith communities. So one last slide, and then I'm done. This is a picture of my sister, Danny, that you get to see. She was learning to cross-country ski, and she's so happy. And one more quote by Paulo Freire to close us out. Only by abolishing the situation of oppression is it possible to restore the love which made that situation impossible. I love that. So thank you. Look forward to hearing from Francisco, and I don't know if we want to take questions now or save them for the end. I'll let you guide us on that, Catherine.
Well, it's up to you all. I'm open to what you want to do with that.
I think I would let Francisco go, and then we can answer questions together at the end and leave a little more time.
Sure.
Sounds good.
We'll
Sounds
be
good.
sure to pick up this question that I see on the post at the end, though.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Jennifer, for your work and for laying that out so beautifully. A little bit about me and my context is, I identify as a Chicano, which means I am an American of Mexican descent, born to Mexican immigrant parents, and my family, geographically, spiritually, and in socially in so many other ways, kind of straddles, what Chicana feminist scholar and activist Gloria Anzaldúa speaks of as the borderlands. So the borderlands are my home, are my upbringing, and the context in which sort of I come to this work. Also a working class identity. Growing up, with immigrant parents, who came here to the United States for reasons of economic, of deep economic challenge and despair, and but knowing that these forces that have existed, the history that existed between the United States and Mexico is a long one, is a complicated one, and as is often said in the movement around immigration, immigrant rights, and within sort of the broader Chicana and Chicana movement, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And that's the true history of the Mexican Southwest. If you want to go into the details of, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, right? These sort of colonizing and colonialist forces that Jennifer sort of is alluding to in terms of the work of abolishing, right? There's a lot of history that's steeped into it. And so the immigration that's happening now, for me, it has to be seen in this much broader context in terms of that story, and also in terms of the root causes of how we respond faithfully and in a way that transforms. So I situate my work in the context of liberation, and I identify as a Latinx theologian and an organizer in the liberationist tradition, sort of lifting up the many sources, but the Latin American liberation tradition, the Latinx liberation tradition, Black theology, feminist theology, all of these intersections in terms of theological sources. But in addition to that, the praxis, the methodologies of social movements and community organizing of people at the grassroots who have formulated movements and have made change happen. And so the quotes that I have here kind of are a representation of how then I situate myself and the way that I sort of think about the work that we do. When we're talking about just formation, what does it mean? What can it mean? And so the first step, is being committed to this sort of work of liberation, of real freedom from oppression. For all peoples, but obviously particularly for people who have been historically marginalized in any way. Clodovus Boff was one of the early theorists of liberation theology in Latin America, and that first sentence kind of sums it up in a lot of ways. Before we do theology, we have to do liberation. And so this is, theology is really was called a second order function. The first order is praxis, is being on the ground and doing the actual work, which you can then reflect on theologically, and then give some teeth to theology, as opposed to the European tradition, which is very much this heady, like, well, we're going to conceive and imagine this God and then bring it down to our human situation. It's actually for us, it's the reverse. We're going to understand the human condition, and we're going to conceive of a God who accompanies and witnesses and wants freedom for God's people. And that's the way that God is conceived of and situated. So you could see sort of the difference and the clashes and sort of these intellectual traditions and what they mean for practice, right? What they mean for church practice. If you think about the average sermon you hear on a Sunday, you can start to analyze it. What is the theological trajectory of this message? Is it coming from on down high, from on high? Or is this God from below? Is this God of the people? And you can start to think about what it means for how we show up in ministry. The second piece is solidarity. Sean Copeland is a Black feminist theologian. She's a Roman Catholic, a queer Roman Catholic, already subversive, right? And in the womanist tradition, right? The womanist tradition is a long tradition within sort of Black feminist theological thought. And so this is how she conceives of solidarity and how humanity is honored. But solidarity being at the very center of what it means for there to be a creator, and for there to be a creator that is deeply connected with its creation, right? Humanity and all of creation. And the fleshiness of that, right? So, which gives obviously Jesus so much more meaning for us, theologically and in practice. And then how, for those of you who are, fellow Episcopalians, but I think this extends to all faith, all those who would aspire to follow Jesus, this idea of the Jesus movement, right? This is the way it's articulated on our official church website. The Jesus movement is the ongoing community of people who center their lives on Jesus and follow him into loving, liberating, and life-giving relationship with God, each other, and creation. And I'm sure you've heard our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, say those three things more than once, but it's important, right? Loving, liberating, and life-giving. Okay, so next slide, please. So that's sort of the religious, theological, and ecclesial, the way I situate myself and the work. And as an organizer, as an activist, I also ground myself in the practice and methodologies of organizing. And so here is sort of a collection of ways of thinking about organizing, from various places of organizing, of the organizing tradition, sort of theological understandings, grassroots understandings from the ground. But for me, if we're going to be a Jesus movement, this is we have to think about what it means to actually be a movement, right? That requires activity, that requires action, that requires a training, it requires discipline, requires a just formation that we're talking about today. The nuts and bolts of what it means to build and to be a part of a movement, I see as organizing, right? Organizing is the process of being engaged in a movement. And so that's what I have expressed here. And organizing is deeply relational work. It's about connecting who we are at many different levels and identifying our shared vision, our hopes and our dreams, our fears and concerns, and bringing all of that together in a way that can leverage our collective power for the good, right? And power as a unit of analysis and understanding is another thing that as a church we don't do enough thinking and talking about. When we think of power, we might think of a certain kind of institutional power or a certain kind of economic power. We might see it as a bad word, but I'm talking about a collective power that comes from people coming together, right? It's a different understanding. And when we can make sense of that power, it can be used for incredibly powerful ways. And we see the lessons of history when people of faith, when allies come together to call out injustice and to stand for something. And so one definition from this that I'll draw to your attention is this idea of faith-rooted organizing. And this comes from Reverend Alexia Salvatierra and Peter Herzl, who wrote this book called Faith-Rooted Organizing. Faith-rooted organizing is bringing people together to create systemic change in our communities and a world in a way that is completely shaped and guided by our faith. So when I talk about organizing in the context of our faith communities, it's about this. It's about how do we understand who we are as people of faith, right? Our narratives, the stories that inspire us, our worship practices. In the Episcopal tradition, and I know in the Methodist tradition, there's this idea of the quadrilateral or the four-legged stool, right? Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. How do we understand all of those elements together and give teeth to them, right? Give context to them through people's actual lives, and how people come together as parishioners, right, in the context of one church, or how many different communities can come together in the context of a neighborhood around a neighborhood issue, and work for justice. That's what the work of faith-rooted organizing aspires to. So, and then you can take a look at the rest of these slides at your leisure. One story I want to lift up about what this looks like in practice is the experience of organizing that I had in Inglewood, California, around the issue of housing justice. And this was, I was a rector there at Holy Faith Episcopal Church, which is a primarily working class community, very multiracial, multi-ethnic, majority Black and Latinx, but not exclusively. Obviously had been historically had been an Anglo church, that in the 50s and 60s, and there were demographic shifts over the, 70s, 80s, 90s into current time, which often happen, which happened in many communities. But in this, when I got there, I started the process of listening, right? Started the process of organizing, using the building block of organizing, which is the one-on-one conversation. Other people call it the relational meeting. And this is where you sit down with somebody and you engage in a very intentional conversation. But it's not just coffee chit chat. It may include some of that. It may start with that, but it actually is about tapping into who we are as people, right? What's this? Who are you? What's the story? What's your story? What brings you to this community? What are the issues and concerns that that move you? What are the things that you care about? What's your vision for the goodness, of this community? And you start to identify really what's on people's hearts and minds about what is good and also what needs to be changed. And so connecting at that level with parishioners, connecting at that level, with other pastors, connecting at that level with community activists, with residents in the neighborhood, is an important part, I think, of, if you're a clergy person, it's essential work. And if you're a lay person, it's essential work. Oftentimes, these are not the things that faith communities are equipped to do, right? We have a certain frame of the way that church has been done. And it has to do with, Sunday worship and making worship happen and putting all the pieces together, especially in the Episcopal tradition, right? We have a beautiful liturgical tradition, which I love. And think about how much time, energy, and resources any given community puts into making Sunday happen week after week. Resources in every way you can imagine. It becomes something of a production. It can become something of a burden. And when I think about the purpose of worship, we can go back to the Hebrew, the prophetic tradition, where in Isaiah, where people were fasting and they wanted to get attention for fasting. And in Isaiah it says, "Is this the fasting that I choose? Here's the fasting that I choose, that you break the chains of oppression," right? And so worship, apart from being actively engaged in addressing, in sort of what Jennifer's quote said, abolishing oppression, in doing the actual work, it's empty worship, and that's part of our tradition. And so when we contextualize worship in the context of what are we doing to usher in a vision of God's loving, life-giving, and liberating vision, what are we doing tangibly to make that happen? That's where I think we can do better work, and how community organizing can help. And so in this context of justice work in Inglewood, we sought to do just that. We started doing this work of lots of one-on-one meetings and conversations within our community and across the community. Through that process, we identified that the displacement was a critical issue, that rents were going up, that there was a lot of speculation going on in the real estate market because of economic development that was being brought forth in the city. And not that we were against economic development, but what we were trying to articulate was, if you're going to have economic development, how can you ensure that those who live in the city benefit from it and do not get displaced and pushed out in the process? It was a city of 65% majority renters, and these renters had lived there for many years and were being pushed out. Apartments were being converted to to luxury condominiums, and so you could see the forces of gentrification along race and class lines coming in pretty powerfully. And so we came together as a community to organize around those issues and pushed forward a rent stabilization ordinance, collecting signatures in the neighborhood through this grassroots effort. But the beautiful thing about it is we never did this apart from who we were as a faith community. And that's what you'll see here, that we engaged, we made use of all aspects of our church life to organize and to strengthen ourselves as a faith community and the issue that we were working on. It was heard in sermons. It was reflected in presentations and testimonials from people who had experienced rent hikes and who had received 30-day eviction notices. They were giving testimony in church. It was we were going canvassing after church with other faith communities, and we prayed together before we went out into the neighborhoods, and then we came and reflected on the work, and then we closed out in prayer again. We used our liturgical seasons to help give meaning to what and theological context to what we were doing, and that's what this idea of posada is. Urgiendo posada means that we are urging for shelter. We are calling for shelter and for sanctuary in our city. And this campaign was a blending of the African American and the Latinx traditions in our community. The posada is the procession where we remember Joseph and Mary as they made their trek, leading to Jesus's birth. And they, as the scripture says, there was no room in the inn. And so we were organizing to make room. And then in the African American tradition, there's a hymn in the gospel music called "Plenty Good Room," and so we were also saying we believe in the vision for God that there's plenty good room, and we were working to enact that. So I'll stop there so that we can engage in a conversation. The last piece is the work that I'm doing now in the context of this Justice Salon at St. Augustine's Chapel here in Nashville. And this is in its early stages, but we're emphasizing equipping lay people and our faith community to do the work, skill building, and training in nonviolence, in the philosophy and the practice of nonviolence and the long trajectory that has in our faith communities, and teaching the skills of community organizing and advocacy so that we can be fully engaged in our faith in that aspect.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I think you already kind of answered one of the questions, Francisco, which was what is Justice Salon? But it sounds like it's a place where you do these trainings and teaching people how to do this work. Is that accurate?
Yeah, the Justice Salon is it is a monthly gathering space that we have, and it started. The first meeting was in person, and it was in the context of someone's home. So we were kind of trying to build the house church model where we gathered for dinner, and we had some content that was shared, and then we engaged in this sort of theological and practical work of justice together. Then soon after COVID hit, and we moved obviously to a straight virtual format, but the Justice Salon has grown and continued. We have some members of our community, some of you may have experienced this, that have been with us only since the pandemic. They found us during the pandemic, and they have been with the Justice Salon for over a year, you know, and I know them very well. And I met them for the first time just on Easter Sunday when we had our first in-person gathering, you know, socially distanced at a park. But we built community, and we are engaging in this work of racial, economic justice, immigrant rights from our faith perspective.
Awesome, thank you. Someone asked during the time that you were presenting, Jennifer, kind of as you were wrapping up, is there a difference in your work between immigration issues and general racism?
Yeah, I'll try and answer a couple of questions in response to that. So if you look at the work of Jesus, Jesus was really confronting the power system, right? The power and the authority that of that day was the government, was this leadership, this structure of power that was all about their power. And you know, those in power didn't like Jesus because Jesus was threatening the status quo. And so I think a really important question for us to look at as we approach liberation work is, where is the power? Who has the power, and how is the power being used? Whether it's the story of the Exodus or whether it's the life of Jesus, we see, and in liberation theology, we see a siding with those who are marginalized, those who have historically been oppressed. And so addressing power and thinking about how power is used, I think, is an important piece of that. So when it comes to working around immigration issues or working around racism issues, it's really the same thing. It really comes down to addressing the power imbalance where people have been marginalized and undervalued. My quotes use the word dehumanized, and that's really what happens in our society. We dehumanize people based on their skin color, based on their religion, based on their ability, based on their indigenous heritage, based on their sexual orientation or social class. We devalue human beings. So yes, climate justice, that also happens there. And we can think about where is the power as it pertains to climate justice. The power is in wealthy countries that are not going to be as impacted by climate justice. And those who are being oppressed and marginalized are the people that we are really called to offer a hand towards, that in order for us to love, it requires that we need to address that power imbalance. We need to lift up and center the voices of those who are marginalized so that we can hear what is needed and what work needs to be done, whether it's housing and addressing housing costs, whether it's housing people coming out of the detention centers that are seeking asylum, whether it's engaging the congregation in conversation. I think these are big, important things, is helping us to have conversations because it really is not possible for any of us to grow up in the United States in this current system where we do practice and we learn to rank people based on these characteristics as children. And it's really not possible for us to live here and not participate in that. And yet the dominant rank categories that many of us may hold, particularly those who are white, and those of us that are Christian, which is all of us, we are part of the dominant religion. And so those of us with dominant status, we don't actually even see or realize the way that people are oppressed. And so listening to these voices whether it's through a book study or conversation or curriculum, is really essential.
Awesome, thank you. Let's see. Francisco, we had a great question about whether your parish organizing was done in connection with a specific organizing group, or was it done more on your own? Were there other faith communities that were taking a similar approach? Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yes, and so is it Christina? I mentioned the IAF, which is the Industrial Areas Foundation, a pretty well-known community organizing network across the country. Some people may know Sal Alinsky, who was one of the early founders of the IAF way back when, but there are other faith networks as well. That Faith in Action is another one, which used to be known as PICO, and Gamaliel is another one that in Nashville. Gamaliel is the major network currently with NOAA, which is Nashville Organized for Action and Hope. In my work, and St. Augustine's Chapel is a member of NOAA. So yes, we are part of these faith organizing networks, and I'd say we do both and. Some of our work is directly connected to what these larger organizing groups are doing, and our work is not limited to that. And I think that that's oftentimes, as faith communities, we sort of miss the boat. We're sort of doing either or, but we're not integrating. And so, a church could be a member of a faith organizing group, and then you'd have to identify how many people within that faith community are actually actively engaged in the work of that faith network, right? And so our work can be strengthened by actually doing this, what I call internal organizing. I take these lessons from my own experience of working as a labor organizer. As a labor organizer for a long time, I worked to represent workers who were already part of a union. And we worked to build a strong, work site, right? So people had a union contract, but the contract needed to be enforced, right? Workers needed to know what their rights were. They needed to know what were the wages, hours, and working conditions, the terms of the employment. Where did they have a voice? What were the limitations? And how can they build power, right? And so my job was to help organize and to facilitate that process so that you could have a strong work site where people sort of knew all those things and had a voice. Translating that into a church context, we need to do that work so that we can build strong internal parish communities, so that lay people really know that that the church does not exist without them, right? And that we sort of move away from our clergy-centric models, and so that clergy can properly understand their role as the role of a facilitator, and not the role of a high and mighty authority of any kind, right? And that we actually get behind people and let people step out, and that's what true organizing, I think, does. When we build that kind of power, then there's actually shared power, there's a shared identity, there's shared leadership, and there's the possibility for making true transformation. And so we can build, we can lean on these organizing networks and connect and learn from that tradition. And then we also got to do the work inside.
Mm-hmm. And what you were just saying brought up again for me one of the questions in the chat about a parish where they give a lot of money, but they rarely find volunteers to engage on the ground. So what ideas do you have for them about engaging folks?
That people, that is an old model of the church, and so it's sometimes it's hard for a community to get outside of that model. And so what that tells me is, you have a parish that really cares about helping people, which is great, and they've identified that one of their strongest resources is financial, which is great and needed, and it doesn't have to be limited to that. And so tapping into the passions, the hopes, and the dreams of the members of that parish through a process of organizing will help identify what is going to move people to action beyond the money, you know? And that only happens through doing this deep, longer term relational work. You know, and it's something, it begins as easily as, you know, having these kinds of conversations. Like what are the conversations happening at coffee hour, right? What are the kinds of conversations happening in adult education? What are the kinds of conversations happening in vestry meetings? Are we examining the upper class status of this parish, or are we just operating with all kinds of assumptions, right? So class and economics are things that we don't talk about at church, right? Where maybe it's not seen as proper, but if we don't, then we stay stuck in these systems, right? We stay stuck in, we're playing this role, and class and privilege is unexamined beyond the fact that we give money, you know? So how does that money get leveraged in a much more transformative way when these conversations are had?
That's great. And this question could be for either of you, but someone noted that they asked if you have suggestions for a church in a primarily white community. They worry about cultural appropriation because so it sounds like there's a desire to be involved, but also they don't want to be, you know, swooping in to save the day or make folks feel like that's what they're trying to do. So I'm curious if you have suggestions for someone in that context.
Happy to, yeah, the churches that I've worked with are largely white congregations, and that's a really important place for us to do a lot of this work. That's where a lot of conversations and book studies need to begin, exploring and preaching on the theology of Jesus as one that is a liberator, and digging into that work. I think it's really important to begin to do some study on the way that implicit bias works, the way that we undervalue human beings, we dehumanize people. It's important to take shame away from this conversation, because many of us feel this sense of shame at the idea of considering oneself as being racist. None of us want to think that we are racist, but the reality is that it's not really possible for us to live here and not be racist, because we rank people and we devalue people. And so in that way, we are participating in this system of power that puts power over and power under and creates an imbalance that is harming people. And I think when we can engage that kind of conversation and get people to begin to see and be able to state and recognize and see signs within themselves of, oh, wow, yeah, this is something that I'm doing. This is what's really important. This kind of shift, that ability, as Francisco talked about, it's that inner organizing, that ability to internally claim and see those ways that we ourselves are complicit in harm. You know, part of my journey around realizing the need to do this work was a moment when I was in Nashville, actually at a conference, staying in the gentrifying, hip and trendy East Nashville neighborhood, and stopped into Burger King and found myself being the only white person in a Burger King filled with African Americans, and felt uncomfortable and realized, wow, I don't want to feel this way, and I have some work to do. And I think it's these moments of being able to see these areas of work and growth within us that are really transformative and help us to engage. People of color are the leaders in liberation work, and white people need to join in. And it takes some introspection in order to do that.
Yeah, and it's shared work that happens, you know. So I think that this is the case. I think listening to the voices of those who have been, one way that one of my mentors has articulated it is letting those who are closest to the pain, you know, speak, right? And so by pain, we talk about the oppression, right? So we talk about these kind of conditions that have trampled upon people for different ways along the lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, ableism, you name it, right? Historically. And how do those who have been closest to that pain, how is that authentic voice allowed to rise? And as you said, Jennifer, really lead the work that is happening. And so then we, as a church, we can look at really tough situations like what's happening right now around policing, right? People are afraid to talk about, this idea of what it would mean to defund, right? Policing in a way that would be liberative for so many, Black and brown communities that have been, historically targeted by police and experienced police violence. But we can have a conversation about it. We can actually have a conversation about what it would mean, right? Starting to look at the average, city budget. What percentage, right? What percentage of that budget goes to policing? What percentage, and how can we begin to do some work of reinvestment, in communities so that we have, access to quality mental health care, living wage jobs. I'm going to add union jobs, that people have, access to the things that they need materially and spiritually to flourish, right? And we can have these kinds of conversations and have them be real and meaningful. And if we're not having those conversations and the rest of the country is talking about this, right? If Black-led movements are talking about these things and we're not as a faith community, then we're not doing our work.
I think another piece I'll add about that is paying attention to what's happening in your city. My city just approved $64 million to build a new jail. And I have been advocating at City Council against the building of a new jail in the middle of the Derek Chauvin trial. This was approved without voter approval or voter information. And so I think it's important for us to be aware of what's happening locally and ways that we can encourage our congregants to speak out about things that continue to marginalize and oppress people. So those are ways that are opportunities to get involved and engaged in what's happening in our community today, what's happening with housing action plans, what's happening with making sure that there is affordable housing and actually housing that is actually affordable, because oftentimes the low income or affordable housing that gets planned is still so expensive that many people can't afford it, especially in some of the higher cost areas like Seattle and Nashville and Alexandria, where cost of living is very high and continuing to go through the roof.
Yeah, and you can really connect onto all those big issues, city issues, regional issues, by connecting with these community organizing networks. That's the strength of these networks, is that they're attuned to those things. And that combined with the internal work, with the spiritual work, with the practical work that you're doing as your own community, I think is really the formula for doing transformative work.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And we will, this conversation, you'll notice my next slide does not have many resources listed, but don't worry, I have jotted down a whole bunch of notes. So I will fill that out with some of these different organizations that we've talked about today. And unfortunately, we won't get to all of your questions. There are a few other great questions, but you will receive the recording from today and these slides in an email, and the slides have our wonderful panelists' contact information in it. So you can always reach out to them directly to ask those questions. I did want to just flag that we do have a webinar next month about visual media and inspiration and engagement. And Francisco will close us in prayer after I also tell you that we do have office hours for Christian formation and discipleship. We serve as a sounding board, and also when you just need a little bit of pastoral presence yourself in doing ministry. So just be aware that we have those every Thursday afternoon, and want to be your partners in ministry to help equip you and just be a sounding board for you. So now I will hand it over to Francisco for you to close us in prayer. Thank you.
Someone asked also in the question, so maybe I'll do a combination of addressing a question and prayer. What are some guiding questions to ask to yourselves or communities to reorient the work towards liberation? And one of the pieces, the ideas that has always sort of inspired me has been from the work of Marshall Gans, who is a community organizer and now a scholar in sort of leadership and social movement studies. And he talks about the power of public narrative and this formula of the story of self, right? The story of us and the story of now. And so put together this, think about what that could mean within our faith context. Who am I, right? These are the questions. Who am I? What power and agency do I have, right? What is calling me, towards movement, towards action, towards engagement? Then the story of us is who are we together, right? As a faith community, as a worshiping community, as a neighborhood, as a city, right? And you can expand that, right? With various, growing rings to make sure that we're building that inclusive, beloved community vision. And then the story of now is, what Dr. King called the fierce urgency of now? How do we put together who I am and who we are collectively towards the good? And so as we close, may we be inspired, in the life and the witness of Jesus. May we be guided by his fierce commitment to love and solidarity. May we be compelled to act toward pathways of healing, justice, and liberation for all, knowing that we might not see the end result, but we are planting the seeds of this future that we know exists, that we know can exist, that is this vision of love, of life, and of liberation for all of God's people. And may we do that in the name of Jesus and in the name of all that is holy. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. Go in peace, friends. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. And to our wonderful panelists, you guys were amazing. Thank you.
Stay in touch. Feel free to reach out.
Sounds good.
Jennifer, it was great to be with you. And thank you,
Thank you.
Catherine and VTS for putting this together.
Absolutely.
Thank you, all of you. Really, really rich dialogue.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.